Hi, everybody. I'm Scott.
And I'm Luke.
And I'm Jonathan.
And this is the No Way to Hollywood podcast.
Thanks for being here.
Oh, right. I was supposed to say that.
Yeah, you were. Yeah, you messed up your line. If you're wondering why we're all holding our phones like morons.
It's because we don't actually want to be here. We'd rather be texting right now.
So in the middle of this, we might actually just start doing this. No, we're not.
Yeah, it's actually because I lent out my audio recorder, and so now we're going to try it with our phones because we're super high tech.
Creative filmmaking geniuses, I believe, is the term you're looking for.
Yes. We are creative filmmaking geniuses.
Sometimes,
not necessarily correlated, though.
Sometimes when you're making a movie or a podcast or something, you come up against difficult things or things that you want that should be there, and you have to find a way around it. And
or it all falls apart.
And so this is our solution for tonight.
It all falls apart. I'm sorry.
We're trying it. We'll see how it goes. It's oddly correlative to what we're talking about tonight, because tonight is
documentary night.
And apparently lag night, too.
I had to think about that for a second. So we are discussing documentaries. Luke, can you help me help our viewers understand what a documentary is?
No, I can't. But I will tell you best I can what we're talking about here. Okay, so a documentary is not something like a biopic where we're making a movie about somebody's life and trying to tell you about that, right? It's not that. It's also not just some fictitious story that you just make up. It's not even like a retelling of someone's
Lord of the Rings is not a documentary.
No, it's not.
Not a documentary.
No, nor is a retelling of
Star Wars definitely is, because I'm a Jedi.
No, that even that would not count as a documentary, because even if it was based on true events, or even if it was like a real event that you're doing a reenactment of it, and it is a retelling of the event through a particular lens. Now, a documentary is told through a specific lens, but what you are doing is you are talking about something. You are unpacking something for someone, and it's not about the narrative per se, it's about what has happened. But what's interesting is that you're building a narrative around that, which is why all documentaries are actually going to try to spin you in a particular direction, make you feel a particular thing about something, just like a movie or a biopic or a film that's based on real events.
Which goes to my first point about documentaries, which are, they simply are not objective.
Absolutely
like you
not.
just said, they are not objective. My film teacher of a class, I don't remember his name, but reminded his class when we were going through the documentary course that by virtue of pointing a camera anywhere, you have made a creative decision, and you have chosen what to look at and what not to look at, which by virtue of even just doing that is not objective, because you could be showing, you can be showing, like all films do, right? You can be showing something that looks really cool and not show that there's a set and that there's people making a movie right there, right? As long as you don't point the camera in that direction, as far as you know, that's the reality. And so even with documentary filmmaking and you're trying to do stuff, whichever direction you point the camera automatically makes it subjective and not objective. You are telling a story no matter what you're doing if you have a camera.
And with certain documentaries, you can actually watch the filmmakers play dirty with this.
Oh, yeah.
So for instance, if you're watching a particularly political documentary about a particular subject, and it doesn't matter what it is, but what they will often do is, for someone that they like a lot, they will have the camera and the lighting look real nice, and you got to believe this person. And then for the person that they don't like, they will show you clips of them putting on the microphone and maybe adjusting their makeup or their shirt. They'll show them getting into their position and getting their smile ready. They will frame it. They'll move the camera a little bit. They will do all sorts of dirty tricks to say this person is not trustworthy, whereas this other person, totally trust them. And that will show you the filmmaker's bias, even if you can't figure it out from watching the content that they're showing you.
Yep. You even get this in, this is not a documentary, but it's a very strange combination when you look at something like Borat, or Borat, the sequel film of America, or whatever the crap he called it, where this is a movie where a comedian basically dresses up like a guy from, I forget what the country, it's
some fake country somewhere.
Or maybe it's real. Eastern
Anyways.
European country that's dealt with the fall of the Soviet Union, and he has language barriers. He speaks English, but not very well, and goes to America. And what the comedian does is he dresses up like this character and then goes and does outrageous things with real people who have no idea that they're being filmed or that this is a movie or this is a comedian. And he tries to get people to bite on the idea that he is a real, immigrant or something like that. And then starts to play games with them, starts to do cultural misnomers, starts to do all sorts of stuff. The latest one had a big scene thing where a girl interviewed Rudy Giuliani, and there's all this stuff about how they made him look like he was basically trying to, in a way, sexually assault this woman who is a character actor for the Borat film, and that's the way it seems. And of course, it's essentially a form of slander or libel because you're editing the thing, and he didn't know what was going on. And if you played it straight back from all different angles, you might feel very differently about that moment in time than when you edit it from certain angles and only show certain parts and make it feel like this thing has happened. Editing and camera framing are incredibly powerful tools to tell a story. And they can be used when you're trying to do anything that has to do with real life. They can be used to great effect to, like you said, play dirty, to get a bias across, to emphasize something. It's natural. So I would then argue that some of the best documentaries come from people who are essentially their subjective point of view is their passionate interest in the subject. So they start to emphasize things that they care about, not necessarily their opinion or agenda, but rather what they're watching, and they're caring about something, so they emphasize that thing. They ask a question about that thing, rather than trying to tell you the story that they already have in their head.
Yeah, and that's something that comes across a lot in the very much more political documentaries that are out there, where it's like, I'm coming out to tell you this idea. Right. This is what I'm gunning for. And so I'm going to build this thing. And to get these people that I don't agree with on this, I'm going to tell you that's a completely different documentary about whatever, right? To kind of fake them into getting into this thing. There's some videos on that topic. But then you're trying to get them to say the things that you want them to say, because you actually have a narrative that you're trying to create a story for. And then you actually see these things like written by, which is hilarious for a documentary, right? Because it's like, you shouldn't have written it, but at the same time you are constructing a story, right? And you can actually see this at play in some fun things that they do at like churches and stuff, where what you do is you ask your person that's going to be on the camera, you ask them a question about something that's totally different, and then when you film yourself asking a different question. So for instance, you film yourself saying, what do you think of this pastor? And then you go to the people and you're like, what do you think about dirty socks? Right? And then what you do is you cut those two things together. She's like, what do you think of this pastor? Oh my goodness, he's so smelly. I just can't even deal with it. Right? and you're creating a narrative. And that is very sketchy, because then you're into the world practically of fiction, because you are creating your own thing, and it can be used for very humorous effect. But in this case of documentary, I agree. I think the best documentaries are the ones where you are exploring a topic that you are interested in. You are not trying to weave a particular tale.
And one of the old documentaries is called Nanook of the North. That is a documentary about Eskimos, a Eskimo in particular. I forget when they shot it. It's black and white, and it's old school film, so it's a while back. And one of the things to know about that is it's staged, right? So nowadays you might be familiar with someone's in an interview telling you a story about something that happened, or maybe like a History Channel is talking about, well, they probably did, or the pharaoh
Aliens.
of this, the pharaoh of this land was upset with this, so he went to war with this, and they start doing a reenactment of, just cut to like pharaoh guy in pharaoh costume acting upset about things. Or maybe you've seen Drunk History, which takes that History Channel idea and makes fun of it. There's lots of different ways to go about this, but the whole point is with the Nanook of the North. They had an Eskimo, and they worked with him, and they basically made a movie. They just treated it like a documentary, and they staged stuff. So he made an igloo, and he slept in it, and he went and they went down and tried to kill a whale, and they were using harpoons and spears when they all totally know how to use guns, and that's what they do now. So it was him, that filmmaker, trying to sort of capture a documentary of a time that had already passed by staging it all. And not telling the audience that he has staged it. Where nowadays you'll see something in the corner says staged or not real, or you can tell because it's different people who are supposed to be the same people who are interviewed, like, or it's Pharaoh, and you're like, no, Pharaoh's not around, right? So you tend to have a good idea of what is and isn't staged, but that doesn't mean that, especially now with technology like, deep fake technology, and like I'm already concerned about that with news and propaganda and other things like that. I mean, a documentary could easily use deep fakes and play a game with who said what, and it could get away with it very convincingly. If you don't know,
I mean, I think you bring up a good point though too, because to a certain extent, like watching the news is documentary filmmaking in shorts.
Sure,
right? Reality television. That's
reality television isn't even close to reality.
But it's documentary filmmaking in a
documentary style filmmaking.
It's more mockumentary, right? Like, and that's the other thing is documentary. If mockumentaries, typically comedies, like a famous one would be This Is Spinal Tap, Best in Show, A Mighty Wind. Trying to think of something more like The Office. The entirety of the show, the U.S. show, The Office,
is supposed to be
essentially a mockumentary where it's pretending to be a documentary the entire time, but everything's staged, written, and that's essentially what reality television is, just with potentially a little bit more reality in the sense of contestants playing a game and they act a certain way. But ultimately, a lot of things are scripted. A lot of things are, there's another written by credit in there somewhere, so it's not exactly reality, is it? And like to your point about news, this taps into a very, I guess, something I care about a lot, which is for all of us to recognize constantly that we are working in a world of narratives and thus creating a narrative context about what we think. And that's because even the news has a filmmaker with a camera pointing a camera somewhere, has an editor splicing together certain information at certain times. Has anchors and news journalists have viewpoints. If you don't believe me, watch Fox News and then watch CNN and tell me what you think is going on. There's different viewpoints at play.
Right. And there's people who get angry about, like, when they find out that, this news station like staged this shot or whatever, and it's like, okay, but you choose which footage to use and when you use it, right? Like if you have a crowd, you're going to shoot the most crowded part of it if you're trying to talk about how many people were there. And if you want to talk about the low population who came out to this thing, then you're going to choose the footage where you have the least amount or whatever, right? Or you talk about other documentaries where I think Fathead is a great example, where the guy was like, okay, if obesity is such a huge problem, then like the way that these other documentaries are talking about it, like I should see these people who are morbidly obese everywhere I go. And he's like, so I went out and I even like stood in front of these stores that are notorious for like obese people. It's like I found 2 people that were pretty overweight after like 4 hours of filming, Right. And so like if you're trying to do this narrative, then you're gonna go grab those shots, you're gonna come together and you're gonna do your thing to try and post this kind of thing. But then it's like, well, what's actually going on in all of this? And so that's where I personally really like documentaries that are like, everything you think you understand is wrong, and here's how this works. I love that kind of stuff because I like trying to get like that behind the scenes picture on what's actually going on in the world.
And I enjoy, I think most of us enjoy documentaries about things that are larger than life, even though they're real life. Like, that's pretty crazy. Icarus is a good example of that. Or even Exit to the Gift Shop. And Jodorowsky's Dune is a favorite of mine. And that's just the guy trying to make a movie. And it's the guy's such a nutso dude. It's fun. So all this to say is documentary filmmaking is still very much filmmaking. There's still very much a narrative, whether the filmmaker is super intentional with an agenda or passionate about a subject and exploring it or whatever. No matter if it's worth your time, if you've heard about it, you're going to watch it. It's likely got a good editor and a good filmmaker behind it, weaving a narrative so you can follow along and know the information, know what happened, see all that. So there's a lot of fun and value that can come out of documentaries, and there's a lot of value that can come out of the news. I mean, journalism has always had some writer telling you what's happened, what's the series of events. They're supposed to have to fact check that and all that kind of stuff. In this current era where people are tweeting all the time, or they're going on social media, or they're your news sources seem to be very, very biased. It can sometimes feel very hard to see what the truth is or what's really going on. But there's still narratives being spun. There's still footage being shot. There's still real events happening, and you're trying to sort out what's going on. So
I guess one of the definitional things, right, then about documentaries is the structure or the style in which they tell it. Because a biopic is you're recreating this person's life for these particular moments.
Typically,
documentary is this is what's happening.
You're either using footage or you're doing reenactments of a specific event, right? But a reenactment is what you'd have in a biopic. So right, it's kind of there. But
okay. So we have stuff that blurs the line, like you've been talking history-wise. One of my favorite examples of this was the TV series Mars that I believe the History Channel did 2 seasons of, where they literally did like interviews and kind of what's going on in real life in the pursuit to get to Mars, and then intercut with that, you have this fictional story 30 years from now of the first humans going to Mars and what that's all like, right? So you do get a little bit of that kind of both and in a lot of situations as well.
Structurally, documentaries kind of go back and forth between present, active, and passive voice, if you will. There's a lot of interviews, a lot of what did happen, what was that. In fact, even if you're watching a documentary where it's a lot of footage of following somebody who's doing something, often there's some moment where like the camera drops, it gets broken, they couldn't be brought into the meeting that was super secret, and the person has to come back out of that, and then the filmmakers be like, so what happened in there?
And then you get the scenes later on where they're asking, so how did you feel in that moment when that was going on? Stuff like that.
So documentaries have a tendency to have a lot of, at least one moment or another, passive voice, sort of looking back, interviewing, talking about what did happen.
Retrospective.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like, where were you? What were you thinking about that? What's interesting about that is that you get this opportunity to have people comment on the thing, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what I love about making documentaries, about making films, is okay, we just went through this process. What was that like? What were we thinking? What kind of stuff was that? I love talking about that, because then you get the kind of the personal experience as I'm showing you footage and photos of those times and those things that we were doing, because you can kind of, instead of just like in the moment footage and talking about, okay, here's where we are and this is what we're doing, you kind of have that hindsight benefit and be like, here's where we kind of got to with all of that, or whatever.
Right.
It's an acceptable form of inner monologue, which is closer to a book's medium, right?
Well, I mean, you've heard the phrase of like hindsight is 20/20, right? So
sure.
Here's what we're experiencing going through it, but then as we get into the future and we look back, we have a more well-rounded perspective because we've had time to process rather than just live out the experience that's happening.
Or we have a even more increased biased perspective after thought. And that's very telling about who that person is, what they may be you start to connect the dots for yourself. You start to say, okay, so if you were like this then and now you're like this now about that same moment, then that indicates to me X, Y, or Z, which again, you can do people dirty that way, where you can cut, see my political opponent's still sore about the fact that this happened, which proves that they were never that great in the first place, X, Y, or Z. But documentaries are a fascinating medium, and they can be very entertaining. I like Jodorowsky's Dune. I liked Icarus a lot. That was, and that's the other thing documentaries, all filmmaking genres have subgenres, but documentaries can be a lot of the different genres, and they can be not scripted, still like trying to see things in real life, real interviews, so on and so forth, not trying to script a story. But you can have documentaries that are comedies, you can have documentaries that are thrillers, you can have documentaries that are dramas, you can have documentaries that are, I guess there could be an action-packed documentary here and there, but likely that's war, and it's not going to feel very action-packed in the same way.
Well, and that's where true crime and those kinds of, you've got these different kind of subgenres which aren't necessarily considered documentary, but they kind of are a documentary. And there's a great video essay on true crime and kind of the nutsoid thing that is linked down there, especially with Tiger King and all that crazy stuff.
Right, and Tiger King's one I haven't watched yet, but everyone talked about it and everyone was into it, and it sounds like
it was definitely a piece that had a particular story to spin. And the minute that you start untangling that, you start going, wait a second. And that's what this video essay is all about is, wait a second, is this something we should even be doing as people? Should we, one, be consuming it, and two, should we be creating it? Because it's really destructive. And because of its narrative bent that isn't based on actual good things, people are driven to certain conclusions that you really shouldn't be coming to because it's not actually based on reality. It's based on a filmmaker's desire to make entertaining media.
All right.
And that's scary.
So if you were going to recommend how to choose a documentary for our viewers to watch, what sort of questions would you ask, and what sort of things would you have them think about in terms of finding something that they're going to actually enjoy?
I mean, you can always do the basics, which is you should know who did what, right? Like, who's the author, who's the filmmaker, and if you guys recommend it to you, who recommended it to you? What best of 10 documentaries of all time? What list is that on? What website? You try to figure out who is telling you stuff and what they seem to think about the world, right? The more you understand that viewpoint, the more you might have a clue about what you're about to watch is.
Well, you also need to know, like, what are you watching? If you're watching a documentary about UFO chasers, well, then you need to know that, like, they're chasing UFOs. So what do you think about that? And where do you think that's going to end up, right? I happen to really enjoy conspiracy theories and those kinds of things. So when I watched Loose Change, I had a blast watching it. But then you do have to be careful because now you're talking about things like, the standard narrative and things like that, right? And you just got to be careful with that stuff, and you got to keep yourself very. If you're going to go down the road, you need to start looking at other sources of information about a particular topic. But that's true even of films. Like, I really, really enjoyed The Big Short, but that filmmaker had a very specific agenda and story to tell about how a particular event went down. I find many of Michael Moore's documentaries to be a lot of fun. I also happen to disagree with a ton of what he says.
Right.
But that's, for me, it's a learning opportunity. What do people think and why, and what are the stories that they're telling? And this is true even like if you watch Expelled, like you can watch the dirty tricks that they're playing to try to make certain people look a certain way. And so whether you agree with the topic or not, I think it's very important to go in recognizing where people are trying to push you their direction or not, and then to start looking at, okay, well, what does the other side think about it? But that's because I think that that's important just for good education.
Well, I would just recommend you figure out the author, but always assume, I don't think any documentary, like we've been saying this whole time, a documentary is an editorial piece. It's an opinion piece. It is not a factual piece. There may be facts in it. There may be factual, if you watch a documentary about September 11th and you get some of the footage of the guys who were following firefighters and they're trying to make a documentary about firefighters and they're one of the only people who caught footage of that first plane hitting one of the two towers, that's real. That happened. They caught that footage. That's, you get a glimpse into what that moment was for those people in that space, okay? And that's very truthful. At the same time, I wouldn't take the entire documentary as necessarily the whole truth. It is a perspective. It is an editorial. It is an opinion. It may be doing its darndest to be as close to the truth as possible. It may be doing its darndest to spin a narrative. But either way, if you treat a documentary as an editorial, whether it's about aliens or about September 11th, no matter how serious or kind of fantastical it may be, and you may find yourself being rather convinced with some, like, sometimes I'm watching that alien documentary, I'm like, that's kind of a convincing idea there. But, remember, it's an editorial. It's an opinion piece. It's a perspective. It's not necessarily the truth.
And let's be clear, too. I feel like we've gone almost to one side of the spectrum and saying all documentaries have this bent. Sometimes the bent is like, hey, here's something I enjoy, and I want you to be able to enjoy it too.
Yes.
So, for instance, in my life, and probably the reason why I've watched as many documentaries as I have is that I enjoy going skiing. And every year there's a film that comes out from Warren Miller Entertainment about skiing. And so for most of my life, my parents and I would go and watch that movie. And it was just hey, we visited these different places. We ran into these different people, and here's a little bit of the story, and go out and make your own story, right? That's the whole point of that kind of movie is we enjoy this. If you enjoy it, we want to show you how much more you can enjoy it and go out and make your story.
Well, now you're making me think about like Rick Steves and, like, hey, I'm going to go travel Italy and sort of be a tour guide for you about some really cool places. And, here's a really cool monument, and here's a great food, and here's something about the culture you should know. And I'm just going to kind of be your tour guide as I walk through X, Y, or Z country. And, can there be, did they not show you the really modern building next to the really cool monument? Maybe, but
It's possible, yeah,
it's
absolutely.
possible. But you definitely get the sense of, I just want you to know some really cool stuff here, and I'm going to be your tour guide and kind of take you through it. And there's stuff like that too. There are such things as like cooking shows, and hey, I just want to cook food, and we're going to show you how to cook something. There's all sorts of stuff out there, and I think it all falls under, at least broadly, the category of documentary on some level. It is something real and using filmmaking equipment to indicate to you what that is. But when we think about long form documentary films, you get into a place that's a little different than the tour guide. Typically, you get a lot more of you can still be passionate about a subject and showing that off. In essence, free solo. And any good documentary, any good editor, any good filmmaker, documentary otherwise, is going to look for the most engrossing story, which in free solo is, while there's, of course, this big structure of will he climb the wall? Can he do this? It's all about who he is, who that climber is, what's his personal struggles, what are his relationships, what's he going through, what's he thinking, how does he operate? That's the story. And so they make sure that they tell you that story while they also have a structure of, hey, he's going to try to climb the wall. What's going to happen? And, honestly, spoilers, but I think it's, the fact the movie showed up is a spoiler. Do you think the free solo guy is going to fall off the mountain and die? Do you think they're going to show that in the documentary?
There probably would have just ended production if that had happened.
Probably. Although that documentary would also be riveting to watch.
Yes.
Right? Watching him follow me, like, that's horrendous. And that actually happened. And whoa. I mean, it might be considered in bad taste, but you technically could do that. That'd be truthful.
Yeah, you also have documentaries like Pandora's Promise about like science and where science is now. So another way to kind of check yourself as you go into a documentary. I like reading the comments and the reviews, and especially anyone who's talking about like, hey, here's the science that I understand based off of, going into this documentary, and I loved it or I hated it because of blah, blah, blah. Like, that's another way to at least try to hone your perspective on where things are with stuff. But that's another way of going about it. But see, it's interesting because there's tutorials, like how do you do something? But even there, like, and yeah, it's kind of documentary. I think it's more tutorial kind of stuff. But like, there are several YouTube channels or video content creators, channel type people who are under fire because like, they're like, oh, look how easy it is to make a blah blah blah, and then you like looked at it and you're like, no,
it's not that easy.
True.
And that's where Matty Matheson, who is a YouTube personality at this point, who does cooking. He's a chef. He does like a cooking show in essence, but his Just a Dash show, which is full of language and lots of other explicit content, but not child appropriate. But the whole, like, half the joke with him in that show is that they don't edit out all the blunders of cooking shows where he makes the spill, or it's taking forever for the thing to stink and like cook in the oven. He's like, come on, it's been 4 hours, like it's all there, and that's a real production. If you're doing a cooking show, it's all those things are happening. Just in this show, part of their shtick is, we're just going to show you what this actually is on some level.
Right, but at the same time, that's a very conscious choice to do that, and it gives you a particular narrative. And that's the kind of documentary that I like to make about filmmaking, where I talk about, here's everything that went wrong during making one of my films, and why this is horrible, and what we did to overcome it or not, and why, we're sitting here with our cell phones in our hands, right? But then, I've been part of other film productions and got to be interviewed, and then they just cut me completely out of the behind the scenes because they didn't want to hear all that stuff. They wanted to instead focus on like, our team was great. Isn't it wonderful how they work together? Here's how we saw.
Disney Star Wars behind the scenes.
Oh my goodness, what's wrong with you?
Minus The Last Jedi is way
pretty
closer.
good. It's way closer.
It's way closer to a real documentary.
See, but then you can also get stuff like the Lord of the Rings behind the scenes stuff, which is like gold for like 80,000 hours. Where you're just like, wow, I'm so impressed with you. Thank you.
I mean, Luke, behind the scenes stuff in general is kind of your jam, and it could be about a movie you hate and you would still love the behind the scenes.
There are so many films that I enjoy way more because I've seen the behind the scenes. I hated the film, love the behind the scenes. Right. Love knowing how they got there.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Great.
I wonder if The Hobbit has really good behind the scenes. I never looked into it because I didn't like the movies very much, but I mean, The Hobbit is notoriously exhausting for Peter Jackson. Yep. Like, there's this one photo that I'm pretty sure. There's this one photo of Peter Jackson on the set of the third Hobbit, and screens are in the background, and the set's all rubble, the castle or something, and everyone's gone, and he's just sitting on one of like the broken stones. And he just looks so exhausted. He just looks so tired. And that photo has become this sort of emblematic symbol of what that production was, where he was with it, and why the Hobbit films that we saw might be where they are in comparison to, say, Lord of the Rings. He's just so exhausted. And there's reasons behind that. You can read more into it. And I'm just curious they did such a great job in the special features and the behind the scenes for Lord of the Rings. I wonder if there's a really good deal for The Hobbit, but that's just a curiosity.
Well, see, but that's interesting too, because images also kind of become, in a way, their own documentary of the moment, right? Like there's the girl like running naked through the streets after Hiroshima,
Tiananmen Square, and the student standing in front of the tank.
Right in front of the tank. You got the kid, with the dog, and during the Martin Luther King Jr. like riot type stuff. And what's interesting with that one in particular is like, that photo is actually the opposite of what it shows, but it shows what was going on culturally, and so it became this image for something, even though the event that was happening was different. From what I understand, having read an article about it, which is basically another form of documentary about it, which could be wrong, right? So like, these are interesting things where even images become the symbol of the story of this thing.
Yeah, cool. Luke, you're starting to make me ask the question if anything I think is real is actually real.
He's a philosopher major over here. Don't be too concerned. He does this daily.
Well, okay, but
it's fine.
And here's the deal, Scott. No, but yes, right? And this is the problem with everything, right? Documentaries are real, and they are really telling you a story. Is it the full picture? No. How could it be? Right? We like, my understanding of reality is not all of reality. It can't be. I have a limited, unique perspective, which is valuable, hopefully, and everything. But it's not all of reality. Even this podcast here, like, we're three guys and we're all talking, but like, it's all filtered through like our brains or by lack of thereof or whatever. Yes. So yes, it's reality, but no.
The lack thereof. Definitely the lack thereof.
Even your perspective, if you went through an event, even your perspective is going to be a perspective, and not the full story. You go talk to somebody else, you get their story, and you do your darndest to be well-rounded. But that's why that alone is an argument I would start making for why you have to eventually submit to some sort of authority somewhere. You have to start submitting to some sort of tale, some sort of narrative, some sort of context for what happened, for what is, for what you are. Like, at some point, you have to accept something, and you're either accepting it without knowing you're accepting it, or you're doing it intentionally. So I recommend that you do it intentionally. So when you watch a documentary, remember it's a perspective, and be smart, be as well-rounded as you can, and
find one that's on a subject matter that you like. I mean, that's.
But if you want one that's really fun, watch Icarus. Because that one is nuts. It starts off as one thing, and you're like, I don't care about this, why they recommend it. And then you start like, wait, what? And you're like, what? So watch that one.
I mean, there's also crazy documentaries like Please Remove Your Shoes, where it's like, and again, it's a narrative, but it's like, hey, this whole thing that's designed to make you safe is actually just theater, which actually makes you unsafe, right? Like, there's interesting ways of looking at the world, and there are documentaries that will help you question your viewpoint on something, which is why I watch documentaries on a wide range of subjects. And again, I like ones that say everything you think you know is wrong. Here's what's really going on. Which is why I'll look into different religious views of things, or people who, here's a documentary about this. Like there are lots of very interesting things out there. And then what I want to know is, do I have a good enough grasp on the topic myself to say, okay, I can see where that went wonky or whatever, or do I need to completely change the way that I view this particular topic?
Oh, absolutely. And documentaries in general are intended to be informational in one way, shape, or form, right?
Or convincing. They might not even be trying to give you good information. They may be merely trying to get you to feel or act a particular way.
Well, giving you certain information, withholding other information.
Well, absolutely. But it's not about the information. It's about influencing your perspective on something.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, why don't we take a minute and actually give a recommendation, maybe of something we've already talked about tonight, to our viewers, of a documentary that they can go see.
Well, there's a lot that I've mentioned throughout the course of this particular episode. Which one do I want to recommend to you?
What was the one we were talking about earlier that he was going to talk about? I don't know if he mentioned yet.
What? Access through the gift shop?
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned it. That's a good one.
I mean,
my child could paint that is another great one on art. Like it. So what do you want to know about, right? Like.
Okay. I already mentioned Icarus. I've already mentioned Jodorowsky's Dune, and I'll even do a third. Well, I don't know. Do you want free solo?
Yeah, I definitely want free solo.
Okay, I'll leave you alone. Jodorowsky's Dune and Icarus are the two I'll mention. One's about a filmmaker trying to make a movie, and he's nuts. And the other one is about stuff and sports and things. Just watch it. Why don't you do a couple?
Okay. Pandora's Promise I found to be very fascinating. That's about nuclear power. And then Fathead was very fun. And that's basically a response to Super Size Me.
And if you can find it on YouTube, try watching. What was it? The Sweatbox.
Oh my goodness! Yes.
If you can, try watching The Sweatbox. That's a film related. It's Disney about them trying to make a movie that ultimately became The Emperor's New Groove,
which is a great movie.
But the Sweatbox documentary is a little bit more unvarnished look at the creative process of filmmaking, animation in general, but also into Disney's era, that time of animation, and some heartbreak goes down in that. So
yeah.
Check that out.
So Jonathan left me free solo, which he's already mentioned. That is a movie about a rock climber who is just insanely gifted and has this goal of climbing without ropes a particular rock face. And like we've mentioned, it is very much about the relationships and what that requires, what that's supposed to be. There are other movies in the same vein that I've watched as well. The Dawn Wall, I believe, is very similar to that. Very good. But one of the other ones I want to recommend, I believe, is called The Biggest Little Farm, which is an interesting perspective on farming and just what that could be, what it should be, what's healthy, what's not. So yeah, that's something else for you to check out if you're interested.
I want to throw one more in because it's a notorious filmmaking one. It's called Lost in La Mancha, and it's just a notorious. It's a documentary. It's all about Terry Gilliam trying to make a film adaptation of Don Quixote, and how sometimes when you're trying to make a movie, everything goes wrong. There's actually a lot more to that story. In fact, that entire thing is like, because of that documentary, that story and that filmmaking process, and that has like taken on a life of its own, and there's things that have developed since that documentary came out, and there's another documentary coming out because of the things that have changed about that. But Lost in La Mancha is a documentary that's very much informative about how you try to make a movie, you do your darndest, and sometimes things just don't work out.
Yep. Well, hopefully this worked out. And thanks for joining us. We'll catch you again next time.
Or not. But yeah, thanks for being here for this one.
Hopefully audio wasn't too bad. I guess we'll see how that turned out.
Yeah, we will.
And everything is real.
Except for, did you know there's lights in the corners right now? Do you even know where you are? Do you know what's behind you right now?
Do you know what's behind us? Do you know what's in front of us? How we're illuminating ourselves right now?
There could be a puppy right behind this couch. You wouldn't even know.
You wouldn't, but can they see the tripod? Can they see the tripod that's right there? I don't even know. Okay.
I think Jonathan's head's blocking it.
Thanks for hanging out. You never wave.
Luke doesn't like waving.
Fine.